The moment I stopped proving I was enough, she lost control. Section 1. The moment affection became conditional. The air in our living room didn't turn cold all at once. It happened in degrees, so subtle that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. It started with the way Lena looked at her phone when I walked into the room, a slight tightening of her jaw that wasn't there a month ago. We had been together for 6 years, built a life on shared jokes and mutual respect, but suddenly the respect felt like a currency she was hoarding. I remember standing in the kitchen, holding 2 cups of coffee, watching her scroll through a gallery of photos from her latest gallery opening. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge the steam rising between us. I realized then that my presence had transitioned from being her anchor to being background noise. It was a shift I couldn't quite name yet, but the weight of it was undeniable. I stayed silent because I wanted to see if she would notice the gap I was leaving. For years, I had been the one to bridge every silence, to ask about her day, to offer the first hug. But that morning, I set her coffee down on the coaster and walked away without a word. I sat in my home office and waited. 10 minutes passed. 20. I heard the clink of the mug, the sound of her footsteps heading toward the door, and then the muffled roar of her car engine. She hadn't even said goodbye. It wasn't an oversight. It was a statement. I sat there in the quiet, feeling the first cracks of a foundation I thought was solid. Why was she suddenly measuring my worth against a standard she hadn't yet voiced? The evening was worse. We were supposed to go to a dinner party at Claire and Matthew Donovan's house. Usually, we dressed together, sharing the mirror and laughing at our reflections. This time, Lena was already dressed by the time I got home. She looked stunning, but there was an edge to her elegance that felt like armor. She didn't ask how my meeting went. She didn't ask if I was ready. She just checked her watch and mentioned that we were already 3 minutes behind schedule. The car ride was a vacuum. I watched the streetlights flicker across her face, seeing a stranger where my partner used to be. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a weapon she was learning how to wield. At the Donovans, the dynamic became even clearer. Lena was vibrant, engaging, and warm with everyone except me. When I spoke, she'd wait a beat too long to respond, or she gently corrected detail in my story as if I were a child who couldn't remember his own life. "It wasn't Tuesday, Evan, it was Wednesday," she said, her voice dripping with a polite, public patience that felt like a slap. I saw Claire exchange a quick, uncertain look with Matthew. They felt it too. The social imbalance was being choreographed right in front of them. Lena wasn't just being distant, she was publicly repositioning herself as the more competent, more aware half of our union. I felt the pressure rising in my chest, that familiar urge to defend myself, to prove I was relevant. But something stopped me. I looked at her, really looked at her, as she laughed at one of Ryan Holt's jokes. She was performing. She was trying to see how much she could diminish me before I snapped. That was the moment I understood. If I fought back, I was playing her game. If I got angry, I was validating her new narrative that I was difficult or unstable. So, I did something I had never done before. I smiled at her, agreed that it was indeed Wednesday, and went to the kitchen to help Matthew with the drinks. I removed the target. By the time we got home, the air was thick with the expectation of a fight. She wanted me to ask what was wrong. She wanted the leverage that comes with being the one who is fine while the other person is spiraling. I could see her bracing for it as she kicked off her heels. She lingered in the hallway, waiting for my opening line. I just hung up my coat, told her she looked lovely tonight, and headed toward the guest room. I told her I had an early call and didn't want to wake her. Her face didn't change, but her eyes narrowed. The script was failing her. That night, lying in the guest bed, I realized that affection had become a reward she only gave when I met her unspoken conditions. It was no longer a gift. It was a tool for control. She wanted me to chase her, to beg for the warmth she was withholding. But as I stared at the ceiling, I felt a strange, cold clarity. I wasn't going to chase. I wasn't going to audition for a role I had already played for 6 years. I was going to let the silence do the work. I was going to see exactly how far she was willing to go to feel superior, and what she would do when she realized she was alone in that pursuit. The next morning, the house was different. The power had shifted, not because I had taken it, but because I had stopped giving it away. I made my own breakfast. I didn't make hers. I didn't ask what her plans were for the weekend. I was polite, I was kind, but I was gone. I could see the confusion flickering behind her eyes. She didn't know how to handle a version of me that didn't need her validation. It was the first time I felt like I was breathing real air in months, but the real test hadn't even begun yet. I watched her from across the kitchen island as she sipped her tea, waiting for her to realize that the person she was trying to diminish wasn't there anymore. She looked like she wanted to say something, to provoke a reaction, to find a way back into the conflict she had carefully prepared. But I gave her nothing but a pleasant nod. I was becoming a ghost in my own home, not out of sadness, but out of a calculated necessity. I was waiting for the mask to slip completely. As I walked out the door for work, I heard her call my name. It wasn't the soft, melodic tone I used to love. It was sharp, testing the waters. "Are we still on for Friday?" she asked. I paused, my hand on the doorknob. I didn't turn around. I just checked my mental calendar, the one she usually managed for both of us. "I'll have to let you know, Lena. Things are changing at the office." I left before she could respond, leaving her with a question I already knew the answer to. Section 2. How comparison entered the relationship. The shift didn't stop at silence. It evolved into a more pointed strategy, comparison. It started small, almost invisible. Lena began mentioning Ryan Holt's career trajectory during dinner, or how Matthew Donovan had recently surprised Claire with a trip to the coast. These weren't just anecdotes, they were benchmarks. She would frame them as observations, but the subtext was a loud, ringing bell. She was looking at my life through the lens of other men's highlights, and she was making sure I knew I was falling short of a moving target. I stayed silent because I realized that defending my choices would only highlight the flaws she was trying to manufacture. I stayed silent because I realized that any defense I mounted would be used as evidence of my insecurity. If I pointed out that I had been working 80-hour weeks to secure our future, she would call me defensive. If I mentioned that I preferred our quiet nights to the performative grandiosity of the Donovans, she would call me stagnant. So I listened. I listened to her praise Ryan's ambition while she looked at my comfortable, worn-in sneakers. I listened to her admire Matthew's spontaneity while I was the one who made sure the mortgage was paid and the taxes were filed. I was being measured against a fantasy, and I was being found wanting. The pressure intensified when we went out with the group again. It was a Friday night at a high-end lounge downtown. Lena was in her element, the center of the circle, radiating a polished energy that felt increasingly performative. She spent the entire evening subtly aligning herself with the successes of the group. When Ryan mentioned his new promotion, Lena didn't just congratulate him. She looked at me with a pained, supportive smile, as if to say, "See? This is what a man in his prime looks like." It was a masterclass in psychological erosion. She wasn't insulting me, she was pitying me in public. I felt the heat rising in my neck, the primitive urge to list my accomplishments, to remind her and everyone else that I was the reason we lived in the neighborhood we did. I wanted to tell them about the private equity deal I had closed that morning, the one that would change our lives. But I looked at Lena's face, at the way she was enjoying the slight discomfort she was causing me, and I felt a sudden, profound sense of detachment. She didn't want my success. She wanted the feeling of being better than me. If I revealed my win now, she would find a way to claim it or diminish it. so I kept it in my pocket. I stayed the quiet, steady Evan she was trying to outshine. "You've been very quiet tonight, Evan," Claire said, leaning in. She was observant, always had been. She sensed the friction even if she couldn't see the sparks. I smiled at her, a genuine, relaxed smile that seemed to catch her off guard. "Just enjoying the company, Claire. It's a lot of big energy tonight. I'm happy to be the observer." Lena's laughter faltered for a fraction of a second. She didn't like that. She wanted me to look small, not centered. She wanted me to look defeated, not content. My lack of reaction was a glitch in her software. That was the moment I understood the game had moved from the house to the world. She was trying to rewrite my social identity. She wanted the world to see her as the vibrant, ascending star tied to a man who had reached his ceiling. It was a classic power move, a way to justify her growing emotional distance. If she could convince everyone, including me, that I was the lesser partner, then her eventual departure or her continued coldness would be seen as a natural consequence of my inadequacy. It was brilliant in a devastating way. I stayed silent because the truth didn't need a loud voice. I watched her interact with a young associate from her firm, someone named Julian. He was everything she was praising lately, loud, flashy, and desperate to prove himself. She leaned in when he spoke, her body language open and inviting, a stark contrast to the closed-off wall she presented to me at home. I didn't feel jealous. That was the strange part. I felt a sense of pity. She was chasing a feeling of importance that was entirely dependent on the eyes of others. I realized I had been her audience for 6 years, and now that I had stopped clapping, she was frantically looking for a new front row. As the night wound down, the group started planning a summer trip to the Hamptons. It was the kind of thing we used to be excited about. Lena jumped in immediately, committing us to a share in a house without even looking at me. "Evan can probably work from there, or he can just stay in the city if things get too busy," she said, her voice light, dismissive. She was already mentally separating our lives, testing how much she could exclude me before I complained. I just nodded. "Sounds like a plan," I said. The lack of resistance seemed to unsettle her more than a fight would have. On the drive home, she was restless. She adjusted the radio, sighed at the traffic, and finally broke the silence she usually guarded so fiercely. "You didn't seem very interested in the trip," she said. It wasn't an inquiry, it was a provocation. I kept my eyes on the road, my voice calm. "I think it's a great idea for you, Lena. You need the break." I purposefully used the word you instead of us. I saw her grip the door handle. "For me? We're a couple, Evan. Don't be weird about it." "I'm not being weird," I replied, my tone level. "I just want you to do what makes you happy. You've seemed focused on other things lately. I'm just giving you the space to pursue that." The car fell silent again, but this time the tension was different. It wasn't her silence anymore, it was mine. I had reflected her own behavior back at her, and she didn't like the reflection. I realized then that she didn't want space. She wanted the drama of me fighting to close the gap. By refusing to fight, I was making the gap permanent. I was beginning to wonder if she realized that her strategy was working, just not the way she intended. Section 3. I noticed who she became around other people. The change in Lena wasn't just about how she treated me. It was about the mask she wore for the rest of the world. It's a strange feeling to watch the person you share a bed with transform into a curated version of themselves the moment a third person enters the room. I began to notice it during our Saturday morning brunches with Julia Carter and Ryan Holt. At home, Lena was cold, clipped, and moved through the house like I was a piece of furniture she was tired of looking at. But the second we stepped into that sun-drenched bistro, she became the partner. She would touch my shoulder, laugh at my dry observations, and lean into me as if we were the golden standard of stability. It was a performance so flawless it was terrifying. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how long she could maintain the lie. I realized that her public affection wasn't for my benefit. It was a branding exercise. She needed our friends to believe we were perfect so that when the eventual fracture happened, she could control the narrative of how unexpected and tragic it was. She was building a wall of public perception that would eventually trap me. During one particular lunch, she spent 10 minutes describing a weekend getaway I had supposedly planned for us, a trip that had never been discussed. I sat there, sipping my water, watching her lie with a smile that reached her eyes. I didn't correct her. I just watched. That was the moment I understood she was no longer living in our relationship. She was managing it. To Julia and Ryan, she was the devoted, supportive partner of a man who was going through a quiet phase. She used my silence as a canvas to paint whatever story she wanted. If I didn't speak up, she told them I was deep in thought. If I didn't laugh, she told them I was stressed from the new merger. She was effectively erasing my actual personality and replacing it with a version that suited her social climb. I felt like a prop in a play I hadn't auditioned for, yet I felt a strange, cold power in my refusal to follow the script. Internal monologue began to dominate my days. I stayed silent because I knew that the moment I contested her version of reality in front of them, I would become the unstable husband. She was baiting me to look like the villain in her carefully constructed tragedy. I watched her hand Julia a gift, a rare book she knew Julia had been hunting for, and claim it was our idea. I hadn't even known she bought it. The psychological pressure was like a rising tide. I was being slowly drowned in a sea of her making, but instead of struggling for air, I decided to learn how to breathe underwater. I was becoming comfortable in the depth of her deception. The turning point came when Julia asked me directly about my upcoming promotion. Lena had clearly been feeding her a story about how I was struggling with the pressure of the move. Julia looked at me with a mix of pity and concern that made my skin crawl. "Lena says you're taking some time to find yourself, Evan. That's so brave in this economy." I looked at Lena. She didn't blink. She just took a sip of her mimosa, her eyes daring me to reveal the truth, that I had already secured the position and a massive equity stake. I realized she didn't want me to succeed if it meant she couldn't claim credit for supporting me through my failure. I smiled at Julia, a calm, steady expression that didn't match the lost man Lena had described. "I think Lena has a very creative way of looking at my career," I said. It was a subtle jab, a tiny crack in the glass. Lena's hand tightened on her glass. "I didn't elaborate. I didn't defend my status. I just let the ambiguity hang there." The table went quiet for a second too long. I saw Ryan glance between us, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. For the first time, the performance had a flaw. Lena's smile stayed fixed, but her eyes were ice. As we walked to the car, the mask didn't slip immediately. She waited until we were blocks away from the bistro, until we were safely inside the pressurized cabin of her SUV. "What was that back there?" she snapped, her voice no longer the warm, melodic tone of a supportive wife. It was the sound of an owner questioning a disobedient pet. I didn't look at her. I just adjusted my seatbelt. "I was just agreeing with you, Lena. You have a very specific way of seeing things. I'm just playing my part." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the cold silence of neglect. It was the vibrating silence of someone who had lost the lead in their own movie. She didn't know how to handle the fact that I was aware of the game. She had spent months convincing herself that I was too slow or too comfortable to notice her subtle repositioning. Now she realized I wasn't just watching, I was waiting. The question was no longer about when she would leave me, but about what I was going to do now that I had seen the monster behind the mask. Section 4. Distance feels different when it's strategic. In the weeks that followed, I stopped being a participant in our shared life and became an observer. I began to treat our home like a shared workspace, a place of high efficiency and low emotional investment. I didn't stop doing my part. The bills were paid, the house was clean, the social obligations were met. But I withdrew the one thing she relied on for her sense of power, my attention. Distance is a funny thing. When one person creates it, it feels like a punishment. When the other person accepts it and expands it, it feels like a liberation. I was no longer waiting for her to come back to me. I was moving further away from her. I stayed silent because I realized that my emotional availability was the oxygen for her ego. By becoming unreachable, I was starving the fire she had started. She began to try harder to provoke me. She would leave her phone out with messages from colleagues visible on the screen, or she would mention late-night meetings that clearly didn't exist. She was looking for jealousy, for a confrontation, for any sign that I still cared enough to be hurt. But I gave her nothing. I would simply nod, tell her to have a good time, and go back to my book. I realized then that there is nothing more terrifying to a narcissist than a man who was genuinely indifferent to their disappearance. I stayed silent because I understood that she was trying to use comparison as a hook to pull me back into the ring. She started talking about a guy from her past, an old flame who had reached out on LinkedIn. "He's doing so well," she'd say, her voice trailing off as she looked at me, waiting for the flinch. "He just sold his tech firm for 8 figures. He sounds so fulfilled." I didn't even look up from my laptop. "That's impressive, Lena. You should definitely catch up with him if you feel the need." The look of pure, unadulterated frustration on her face was more satisfying than any argument could have been. The psychological pressure was shifting. It was no longer on me to prove my worth. It was on her to prove she could still affect me. She began to unravel in small ways. She became louder, more erratic. She would intentionally break things in the house, a vase, a glass, just to see if I would rush to her side. I didn't. I would simply clean it up the next morning, silent and methodical. She was losing her grip on the dynamic she had worked so hard to establish. She had wanted a partner she could look down on, but she had ended up with a partner who didn't even see her anymore. I noticed she started spending more time at Claire and Matthew's, looking for the validation she wasn't getting at home. I stayed back. I started taking long walks in the city, reconnecting with the parts of myself I had suppressed to make room for her. I realized I had been shrinking for 6 years, making myself smaller so she could feel larger. Now, in the space I had created, I was expanding again. I felt stronger, clearer, and more dangerous than I had ever been. I wasn't a victim of her betrayal. I was the architect of my own exit. One evening, I came home to find her sitting in the dark in the living room. No lights, no phone, just her staring at the wall. It was a classic play for sympathy, a "look how much you're hurting me" pose. I walked in, flipped on the lamp, and headed toward the stairs. "Evan," she called out, her voice cracked and fragile. "Don't you care? Don't you see what's happening to us?" I stopped on the 3rd step. I didn't turn around, but I let the weight of the moment settle. I felt the old Evan wanting to go to her, to hold her, to apologize for things he didn't do. But that Evan was gone. I stayed silent for a long time, letting her own words echo in the room. "I see exactly what's happening, Lena," I said finally, my voice as cold as a winter morning. "You're realizing that the game only works if I'm playing, and I've retired." I continued up the stairs, leaving her in the pool of light she hadn't earned. I could hear her breathing, a sharp, ragged sound that told me she was finally starting to feel the walls closing in. That night, for the first time in years, I slept without the weight of her expectations pressing on my chest. I knew the next phase was coming. She would either double down on her tactics or she would break. Either way, I was ready. I had the leverage now, and the best part was, she still didn't know what it was. She thought this was about her old flame or her career. She had no idea that I had already made the most important decision of our lives, and that she was no longer a part of the future I was building. The morning brought a new kind of tension. She was waiting for me at the breakfast table, her eyes red-rimmed but her jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. She had a folder in front of her. "We need to talk about the house, Evan," she said. Her voice was steady, reclaiming the businesslike tone she used when she wanted to dominate. I sat down across from her, poured myself a glass of water, and waited. She thought she was about to deliver a blow. She had no idea I was the one who had already moved the target. Section 5. Silence changes the rules of the game. The folder sat between us on the mahogany table like a boundary marker. Lena tapped her perfectly manicured nails against the cardstock, her eyes scanning my face for a flicker of fear. This was her play, the ultimate leverage in an American marriage. She was going to talk about assets, equity, and the practicality of our current arrangement. I realized she had spent her sleepless night rehearsing this confrontation, sharpening her arguments to ensure I felt the full weight of what I stood to lose. But she was calculating based on a version of me that no longer existed. I stayed silent because silence is the only thing a manipulator cannot edit. If I spoke, she could twist my words. If I argued, she could label me as aggressive. By offering her a blank slate, I was forcing her to look into a mirror. I watched her open the folder, revealing a series of spreadsheets. She had itemized our life. "Evan, I've been thinking about the future," she began, her tone clinical, almost rehearsed. "If we're going to continue like this, living as roommates, we need to be realistic about the estate. I think it's time we look into a legal separation of assets. It's for both our protections." The psychological pressure she was applying was designed to make me panic. In her mind, I was the one tied to this house, the one who valued the status of our zip code more than my own peace of mind. She expected me to beg for a chance to fix things before the lawyers were called. Instead, I picked up the folder and flipped through the pages with the detached interest of a bank auditor. I noticed she had significantly undervalued my private holdings and overestimated her own contributions to the joint accounts. It was a bluff, a clumsy attempt to scare me back into submission. I realized then that she wasn't just losing her love for me, she was losing her respect for my intelligence. I stayed silent because I knew something she didn't. I knew that the equity deal I had closed weeks ago had already tripled my net worth, and the paperwork was filed under a new corporate entity she had no legal claim to. I let her finish her pitch about fairness and moving in different directions. When she finally stopped talking, the room felt heavy with the weight of her expectation. She was leaning forward, waiting for the old Evan to break down or lash out. I simply closed the folder and pushed it back toward her. "If this is what you need to feel secure, Lena, you should proceed with it," I said, my voice as calm as a still lake. "I won't stand in your way. Just make sure the final numbers are accurate before you send them to your attorney. Some of these valuations are optimistic." Her expression faltered. The power she thought she was wielding, the threat of leaving, the threat of financial ruin, was hitting a wall of absolute indifference. It was the first time I saw true doubt in her eyes. She had expected a war. I was giving her a peaceful surrender she didn't know how to occupy. That evening, I didn't stay home to watch her stew in her own confusion. I went out for a solo dinner at a place we used to frequent. I sat at the bar, enjoyed a steak, and talked to the bartender about the upcoming baseball season. I felt a profound sense of lightness. The silence wasn't a burden anymore. It was a shield. I realized that the rules of the game had changed because I had stopped trying to win. When you stop playing for the prize your opponent is dangling, the opponent loses their purpose. Lena wasn't a partner anymore. She was a ghost of a life I had already outgrown. When I returned, she was waiting in the kitchen, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked smaller somehow, less formidable without the stage of a dinner party or a group of friends. "Why aren't you fighting me, Evan?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. 6 years, and you're just going to let me walk away with a folder of papers?" I leaned against the counter, looking at her not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating clarity. I stopped fighting when I realized you were only using the fight to feel relevant, Lena. I'm not letting you walk away. I'm just not holding on to a ghost. The cliffhanger wasn't in her departure. It was in her realization that she was already gone. She had spent months trying to make me feel invisible, only to discover that in the process, she had made herself unnecessary. She stayed in the kitchen as I went upstairs, the silence between us now permanent and deafening. The rules had changed, and for the first time in our relationship, I was the one who knew the ending. Section 6. When effort is no longer guaranteed. The following week, the atmosphere in the house shifted from Cold War to absolute stillness. I had officially stopped the performance of being a partner. I stopped checking if she needed anything from the store. I stopped adjusting my schedule to match hers. I stopped being the buffer between her and the world. It was a quiet withdrawal of effort, a strategic retreat that left her standing on an island of her own making. It's amazing how much work goes into maintaining a relationship, and how quickly it collapses when only one person is doing the heavy lifting. I stayed silent because I wanted her to feel the vacuum. For years, I had been the one to smooth over her moods, to anticipate her needs, and to provide the emotional stability she lacked. Now, I provided nothing but polite, distant courtesy. When she complained about a difficult day at the gallery, I didn't offer a listening ear or a glass of wine. I simply nodded and said, "That sounds challenging," before returning to my own work. I realized that my empathy had been a gift she had taken for granted, and now that it was gone, she was starving for it. I stayed silent because I was observing the comparisons backfire. She tried to mention Matthew Donovan again, how he had just taken Claire on a surprise trip to Paris. Usually, I would feel a twinge of guilt or a need to compete. This time, I just smiled. "Claire deserves it," I said. "They seem very focused on each other right now. It's good to see." By refusing to be triggered, I was making her comparisons look pathetic rather than provocative. She was trying to use other people's lives to shame me, but I was too busy living my own to be shamed. The psychological pressure was now entirely on her. She began to realize that her value in the relationship was tied to my willingness to pursue her. Without my pursuit, she was just a woman living in a house with a man who didn't seem to care if she stayed or stayed out all night. She started staying out later, trying to provoke a "Where were you?" text that never came. She would come home at 2:00 a.m. making noise, waiting for me to confront her. I was always asleep, or at least I appeared to be. The lack of a reaction was driving her to a state of quiet desperation. I noticed her behavior around our friends change as well. The golden couple mask was cracking because I refused to hold up my side of the frame. At a gallery opening she hosted, she tried to pull her usual trick of subtly belittling my interests. "Evan is so devoted to his spreadsheets," she told a group of potential donors, her voice tinkling with mock affection. "I think he'd marry his laptop if he could." In the past, I would have laughed awkwardly or tried to prove my creative side. This time, I just looked at the donors and said, "The spreadsheets allow me to appreciate the art without worrying about the cost. It's a fair trade." The silence that followed was uncomfortable for her, not me. I hadn't been mean. I had been honest and grounded. Lena looked like she had been slapped by a truth she wasn't prepared for. She realized she couldn't make me look small when I was the one standing on the foundation I had built. The power shift was becoming visible. People weren't looking at her with admiration. They were looking at her with confusion. Why was she mocking the man who clearly provided the life she enjoyed? Her silent dominance was being exposed as simple insecurity. Internal monologue. I stayed silent because I realized that her entire identity was built on being better than someone. Without my cooperation and being less, she had no height. She was just an average person with an average ego, struggling to keep a grip on a narrative that was slipping through her fingers. I watched her move through the room, trying to find someone else to play her game, but everyone else was too busy with their own lives. She was becoming a background character in her own event. As the night ended, she was exhausted. The effort of maintaining her persona without my support had drained her. In the car, she didn't try to fight. She didn't try to compare. She just leaned her head against the window and watched the city go by. "You've changed, Evan," she said softly. It wasn't an accusation this time. It was a realization. I didn't look over. I just kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel. "I haven't changed, Lena. I've just stopped trying to convince you that I was enough. I realized that's not my job. It never was." The cliffhanger came when we pulled into the driveway. She didn't get out of the car. She sat there looking at the house we had bought with such high hopes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling for the first time. I turned off the engine and looked at her, truly seeing the fear in her eyes. "Now," I said, "the silence finally gets to speak." I got out and walked inside, knowing that the next time we spoke, it would be to end it. Section 7. She felt the shift before she understood it. The realization didn't hit Lena like a lightning bolt. It seeped into her life like a rising tide, cold and relentless. For weeks, she had been operating under the assumption that I was a variable she could control, a constant in her equation that would always balance out her own volatility. But as the silence deepened, she began to realize that the equation itself had changed. I was no longer the anchor she could pull against to feel her own strength. I had let go of the rope. I watched her from the periphery of our shared existence, noticing how she started to falter in the very spaces where she used to be most dominant. I stayed silent because I wanted her to confront the vacuum of her own making. She began to overcompensate in our social circles, her stories becoming more elaborate, her laughter a pitch too high. At a charity gala for the city's Arts Council, I saw her corner Julia Carter and Claire Donovan. She was talking about our new chapter, hinting at a move to a larger estate or a European sabbatical. I stood 10 feet away, nursing a club soda, watching the confused glances between her friends. They knew. They could see that the man she was describing, the enthusiastic, compliant partner, didn't match the man standing calmly across the room. The psychological pressure was now manifesting as a physical restlessness in her. She couldn't sit still in the house. She would pace the hallways, moving pillows, rearranging books, trying to find a configuration of our life that felt right again. But the rightness had been built on my constant effort to appease her, and that effort was gone. I stayed silent because I realized that any word of comfort from me would only prolong her delusion. I was giving her the harshest gift a person can give, the truth of her own isolation. She had spent so long comparing me to others that she had forgotten how to simply be with me. Internal monologue. I realized that she was mourning a version of me that she had worked so hard to kill. She wanted the old Evan back. The one who would apologize for her moods, the one who would chase her after a cold shoulder. But that man had been buried under the weight of her own dismissiveness. I stayed silent because I understood that she wasn't actually missing me. She was missing the power she felt when she could hurt me. Now that I was immune to hurt me, now that I was immune to her barbs, she was powerless. That was the moment I understood that our entire relationship had been a hierarchy, not a partnership. The distance between us became a physical presence. We would pass each other in the kitchen like two strangers in a high-end hotel. I stopped asking, "How was your day?" Not out of spite, but out of a genuine lack of interest in the performative answer she would provide. One Tuesday evening, she finally broke. She slammed her laptop shut and looked at me, her face pale in the glow of the under-cabinet lighting. "Is this it, Evan? Are we just going to wait for the house to sell? Are you even in there anymore?" I didn't stop peeling the apple I was holding. I just looked up, my expression neutral. "I'm exactly where I've always been, Lena," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "The only difference is that I'm no longer auditioning for the role you wrote for me. You spent months telling me and everyone else that I wasn't enough. I finally agreed with you. Why are you upset that I've accepted your terms?" She opened her mouth to argue, to launch into a practiced defense about wanting me to be my best self, but the words died in her throat. She could see that I didn't believe her anymore. The leverage of her high standards had vanished because I no longer cared about meeting them. That night, she didn't go to the guest room. She stayed on the sofa, the lights off, watching the shadows of the trees dance on the ceiling. I could hear her crying, not the angry, manipulative tears she used for effect, but a soft, rhythmic sound of genuine grief. I felt a pang of old habit, a ghostly urge to go to her and tell her it would be okay. But I stayed in bed. I stayed silent. I knew that if I comforted her now, I would be signing up for another 6 years of the same cycle. The shift was permanent. She felt the loss of my attention, and for the first time, she understood that attention was a privilege, not a right. The cliffhanger came the next morning when I found a suitcase by the door. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't packed for a weekend trip. It was one of her designer bags, half-zipped, with the sleeve of a silk blouse peeking out like a white flag. She was standing by the window, looking out at the driveway, her car already idling. She didn't look like the confident, dominant woman of 3 months ago. She looked like someone who had played a high-stakes hand and realized, too late, that the other player had already left the table. Section 8. What remains when control stops working? The final movement of our collapse was surprisingly quiet. There were no shouting matches, no thrown plates, no dramatic exits in the middle of the night. It was a clinical, orderly dissolution of 6 years of life. Lena moved into a luxury apartment downtown, a space that was as cold and curated as the persona she had tried to project onto us. I stayed in the house, not out of sentimentality, but because it was a practical base for the next phase of my career. The silence that had once been a weapon between us now became my greatest ally. It was the sound of a man who had finally stopped trying to prove his worth to someone who was never going to acknowledge it. I stayed silent during the final mediation meeting. Lena's lawyer tried to argue for a larger share of our liquid assets, citing her career sacrifices and her role in building my social standing. I watched Lena as her attorney spoke. She wouldn't look at me. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a speck of dust on the conference table. I realized she was embarrassed. She knew that every word her lawyer said was a lie, a final attempt to exercise a control that had already evaporated. I didn't contest the figures. I didn't fight for the money. I had more than enough, and I knew that every dollar I gave her was a payment for my total and absolute freedom. I stayed silent because I knew that my success was the only response needed. 6 months after the separation, I was featured in a major business journal for the equity deal I had finalized during our coldest months. The headline was about the quiet architect of the new market. I didn't send her the link. I didn't post it on social media. I knew she would see it. I knew Claire and Julia would see it. I knew that the narrative she had constructed of a stagnant, struggling man would be shattered by the simple reality of my competence. I wasn't doing it for revenge. I was doing it because it was who I was when I wasn't being suppressed. The final closure didn't happen in a courtroom or through a legal document. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon at a coffee shop we used to visit when we first started dating. I was there for a meeting when she walked in. She looked tired. The polish was still there, but the vibrance, the performative energy had dimmed. She saw me and hesitated, then walked over. We sat across from each other for 10 minutes. She talked about her new gallery, about the friends we no longer shared, about the stress of being on her own. I listened, truly listened, without the need to fix her or the desire to judge her. "I didn't think you'd actually let me go," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the espresso machine. "I thought you'd fight for me. I thought that's what people who love each other do." I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I felt a genuine sense of peace. "I did fight for you, Lena," I replied. "I fought for the person I thought you were for 5 years. But when you started using my love as leverage, I realized I was fighting the wrong person. I was fighting myself, and that's a war I decided to win." Internal monologue. I stayed silent as she processed that. There was no anger left in me, only a profound sense of moral clarity. I had regained my self-respect not by defeating her, but by refusing to participate in her diminishment of me. I had used silence to find my own voice again. The power shift was complete, and it hadn't required a single insult or a raised voice. It was the power of a man who knows his own value and no longer requires an audience to confirm it. As I walked out of that coffee shop, I didn't look back. I didn't wonder what she was thinking or if she would call. The story was over. I had stepped back emotionally, let the imbalance expose itself, and in the wreckage, I had found a version of myself that was stronger, quieter, and entirely mine. The modern relationship often becomes a battleground of egos, a series of comparisons and power plays, but I had learned the ultimate secret: you cannot control someone who is willing to walk away in silence. I drove home through the rain, the city lights reflecting on the pavement like a path toward something new. The house was quiet when I arrived, but for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like a void. It felt like a foundation. I sat in my office, opened a book, and let the stillness wrap around me. I had stopped trying to prove I was enough, and in doing so, I had become more than she could ever understand. The game was over, and I had won the only prize that mattered, myself. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.